faster meeting because Vern's not here. Don't tell him that though, Mary Lou. Thank you. All right, Tom. All right. Today we finish up the series, Jesus in His Own Words. And we're going to look at his final I am statement, and it's simple. I'm the true vine. But this one's different because he's not really after the Jewish leaders so much. He's not trying to prove his divinity so much. It's actually a message to us. And it's a little tougher to understand. So I'm going to come at it in a different sort of way to maybe bring us up to speed. So right now, number one, I want you to go back about 750 years before Jesus. I want you to go back to the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah was a prophet of God. Now, if you don't know what a prophet of God was, imagine a preacher who lives in Ohio. He doesn't have a, quote, home church. He just walks all around the state preaching. One minute he could be up in Cincinnati or down in Cincinnati. Next he might be up in Cleveland. Hard to tell where this preacher's going to be. But that's pretty much how Isaiah did his ministry. And you also need to know that he was a character. He often dressed up in special costumes. He was a musician. He was a singer. And he may have actually sung this song of the Vineyard that I want you to look at with me. Anyway, here he goes. I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyards. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press. And then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard than what I've done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I tell you what I'm going to do with my vineyard. I'm going to take away its hedge. It'll be destroyed. I'll break down its walls and it'll be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I command the clouds not to rain on it. Now the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are the garden of his delight. And God looked for justice, but he saw bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but he only heard cries of distress. In the Old Testament, a vineyard is a sign of blessing. It's a symbol of prosperity. If your vineyard was producing great grapes, it was a sign that God is blessing your family. And if by some chance you lost your vineyard, that's the ultimate disgrace, ultimate humiliation. Now, real quick, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but in this story, the owner of the vineyard is God. And the vineyard itself represents God's people. And God had planted the very best vines. And he expected a great harvest from this vineyard, but all he got was bad grapes. And his response is pretty harsh. I'm going to just tear it down and let it go to waste. You have to ask yourself, why? Well, the simple answer is that God's expected justice from these people. But all he got was bloodshed. We see that even today. God expected righteousness from his people. But all he heard was cries of distress. In other words, God's people refused to remain and bear fruit. I want you to sort of keep those words in your brain as we go through today. Remain and bear fruit. And they also refused to obey and to love the owner of the vineyard. But God in his wisdom, he never really broke down the walls like he promised. Okay, I want you to zoom ahead now 750 years. We're going to come to the early time in Jesus' ministry. Jesus is in Jerusalem. This is way at the beginning of his ministry. And he's, no, I'm sorry, I just told you that wrong. This is after the triumphal entry. He is now in Jerusalem teaching. He says this. He starts out. Listen to another parable, a story. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. I can see somebody in the crowd going, oh, yeah, I know this. This is from Isaiah. Yeah, I heard this in Sunday school. Well, Jesus is going to put a twist on it. And Jesus continues. Then he rented the vineyard out to some farmers and went on a journey. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to him, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his own son to them. They will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him, and they threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, the crowd replied. And he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will take away his share and give him his share. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce fruit. Well, Jesus sort of reshapes Isaiah's song. The vineyard is still God's people. The owner is still God. But this time it's not an issue of bad grapes. It's an issue of bad tenants. These are the people who are supposed to be cultivating and harvesting the vineyard. It was their job that it be healthy. And everybody knew Jesus was talking about the religious leaders of his day. And so when it was time to give the owner his share of the fruit, God sent prophets of the Old Testament, and the people of these wicked tenants killed the prophets. So God sent more servants, and these wicked tenants killed even more of the prophets. And then one day God said, I'm going to even send my own son. They'll respect my son. And by now you understand that Jesus is openly talking about his coming death at the end of this week. He knows in just a few days he's going to be hung on a cross by these religious leaders. And so when Jesus said, what's God going to do about this? The crowds, they say, well, they're going to get what they deserve. And somebody else is going to get the vineyard. Now, the point I just want you to think about, the whole point is that this whole vineyard is now going to be given to somebody else. It's no longer going to be entrusted to these Jewish people. And you have to ask yourself why, because they refuse to remain and bear fruit. They refuse to obey and love the owner of the vineyard. All right, last jump. This is to the end of the week, the last week of Jesus. This is where we were last Sunday talking. This is the night of betrayal. They had the Last Supper. They walk out to the Garden of Gethsemane. In a few minutes, Jesus is going to be arrested and led away. On this fateful night, he has another teaching. And he says, I am the true vine, and my Father's the gardener. I'm the vine, and you're the branches. You got to see how majestic that is. He takes an image that's almost 1,000 years old, and he rebrands it completely to fit what he wants to say. God's people are no longer the Jewish people exclusively. The vineyard has now been opened up to people, all people, everywhere. That means in some mysterious way this morning, you are part of this story. You are now part of the very vineyard of God. We've talked about some controversial things over the past 2 months. Jesus saying, I'm the bread of life, sent down from heaven, and then feeding 5,000 kids, or people with a kid's Happy Meal. He proclaimed, I'm the light of the world, and he gave sight to a blind man. He said, I'm the good shepherd. He said, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Christ, I'm the Son of God. I'm the resurrection and the life. You believe in me, you'll live even if you die. And at the Last Supper, Thomas doesn't quite get the whole teaching, and he says, Lord, where in the world are you going? We don't know where you're going. And Jesus, very comforting, but very controversial. His response was, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I hope at least in these past 2 months I have convinced you to never be satisfied when a friend or family says, oh, Jesus was a great man, he was a great teacher. That's not at all what Jesus claimed to be, and we need to understand that. Religious leaders understand it extremely well. That's why they crucify him at the end of this final Holy Week. But I love this claim today. And it's, like I said, it's very soft. It's very subtle. So the vineyard, which used to be God's people, but it didn't work out right. And the vineyard, which was still God's people, but now people had been put in charge of it, but they didn't work out in taking care of God's family. So now it's going to be given away to a new people. You and me and every citizen of this world. Wow. Oh, there's a catch. Did I mention that? In order to be part of this vineyard, you have to do 2 things. You know what they are? Or he told you twice. Number 1, you have to remain and bear fruit. George Whitefield. He preached in the 1700s, and a lot of these outdoor revivals. Had a huge sermon. Thousands of people responded to his message, and somebody says, how many people were saved? And his response, very biblically true, he said, well, we'll know in 5 years. In other words, only time will tell the people whose commitment was just shallow and the people whose commitment was real and genuine. One thing I've learned through the years is stop trying to figure people out. Stop trying to figure out which person God will use and which person God won't use. Because I have been surprised. I've seen people that I thought would never, ever get their life together, much less humble themselves to become a believer, a Christian. And they did it. And men and women who possess such a vast maturity in the faith, I thought, just turned and walked away from it. So I just simply at this point remind you of the words of Jesus. You want to be part of the vineyard, or you need to remain and bear fruit. Now, let me real quick just give you the Jesus teaching. Okay, it won't take but a second. This is in the upper room before they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm the true vine. My Father's a gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. While every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so it will be even more fruitful. You're already clean because of the word I spoke to you. Remain in me and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain with the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I'm the vine. You're the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And if anyone does not remain in me, he's like a branch that's thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burnt. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish. It will be given to you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I've loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I've told you this, that my joy may be in you and that your joy might be complete. Well, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to know what Jesus is talking about. Count them. Remain 11 times. Fruit 7 times. You got the image. You know this when you nailed it. Jesus is the vine. You're the branches off the vine. And his first piece of advice is stay there. Remain. Bear fruit. Now, I know a lot of people in the church are less than thrilled whenever I talk about God cutting dead wood out of a church. But after all, I'm not saying that. Jesus just did. Bearing fruit. Now, that's one of those church words that we talk about so often that maybe sometimes we just forget what it means. Very quick, I wanted to find out exactly what that means, and so I got out my trusty computer and I just Googled bearing fruit, Christianity. Here it is, 1 minute response. It means to demonstrate by the way you live that you've truly repented from past sins and you now love God. It means that the Holy Spirit is producing fruit like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control in your life. Bearing fruit is to act with goodness, righteousness, and truth. It's to live a pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, sincere life of mercy. Bearing fruit is to tell our story with others so they can find salvation in Jesus. Bearing fruit is living like Jesus. It's growing in the knowledge of Jesus. It's to do good works for one another. It is to live in a community of believers, helping and serving and loving one another. And it is to become closer to God through our own worship and prayer and praise and offerings in the Word. Simply put, it is to live and act like Jesus. And when we bear fruit, we get closer to Jesus. And the closer we get to Jesus, the more fruit we automatically bear. But the very moment you stop getting closer to Jesus, you put distance. And the distance begins to separate you from Jesus. And don't kid yourself, you will eventually die spiritually if you choose to pull yourself away from the presence of Jesus. It's gutsy. But you know what the other one now is too? It's called obey and love one another. Just a final verses, same little thing from Jesus. My command is this, love one another as I loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You're my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I call you now friends because everything I've learned from my Father I've shared with you. You didn't choose me, but I chose you to go and bear fruit. Fruit that's going to last. Then the Father will give you whatever you want in my name. And so this is my command. Love one another. Love is a glue that keeps you on that branch. Obedience is what brings faithfulness. Jesus understood that the work of the church could only happen if believers loved one another. In fact, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he has a prayer, a final prayer. It's a long, long prayer, John 17. But the heart of that prayer is for us, that somehow we will get our act together and love one another. And when you remain in Jesus, when you bear fruit, when you obey the commands and you love the owner, something wonderful happens. You stop being a slave and you become a friend. A song we always sing here, but sometimes we have to explain it. A lot of people say, well, it's kind of arrogant and self-righteous to be singing that I'm a friend of God, but no. Jesus has just told you today that if you remain and bear fruit, if you love and obey, you're more than just believers. You're friends of God. I want you to stand, and we're going to use that song as a final song to close this morning.
Who am I that you are mindful of me? That you hear me when I call. Is it true that you are thinking of me? How you love me. It's amazing. I am a friend of God. I am a friend of God. I am a friend of God. He called